in a more ornate tunic than the others. She had long blonde hair, darker than Illyria's, but otherwise similar, and eyes more gray than green, or blue, but the same shape as both hers and Veresa's. The other rangers positioned themselves around her as she smiled and held up her bow in salute. "Welcome home, Illyria," Sylvanas called. "Now what is this trouble you have brought us?" Even from across the river, she radiated intensity, as if she could will the answers to appear. Illyria smiled at her sister's greeting. Sylvanas, Ranger General of all Kel'Thalas, was as forceful as ever, then shook her head. "I did not bring it, Sylvanas," she answered truthfully. "I had hoped to outrun it, but I do bring possible salvation." She glanced back at the dead trolls behind her, and at Veresa, who stood swaying and pale, and resolutely facing away from the recent corpses. "I must speak to the council." "I do not know if they will listen," Sylvanas warned. "They are too busy worrying about these fires to consider much else right now, as am I. They are appearing all across the forest, seemingly at random." She glanced pointedly at the dead trolls. "And now I must tend to this matter as well." Illyria grimaced and looked down. "They will listen," she promised. "I will give them no choice." "What is the meaning of this?" an Asterian Sunstrider demanded. He and the Council of the Silvermoon were discussing matters in low, serious voices when Illyria walked in unannounced and uninvited. Several of the High Elf rulers rose from their seats, surprised at her presence, but Illyria ignored them. She focused only on Anasterian. The High Elf King was old even for an elf, with hair that had long since turned white and skin thin as parchment and lined as a piece of old wood. He had gone from slender to frail, but his blue eyes were still piercing, and his voice, though thin as well, was still filled with authority. Illyria instinctively shrank back from his anger, but then she remembered why she was here and straightened. "I am Illyria Windrunner," she announced, though she knew most of the council members recognized her. "I have been beyond our borders and have fought alongside the humans in their war, and I have returned to bring you grave tidings, not just for them, but for us." She frowned and studied the men and women before her. "The horde the humans warned of is real and vast and powerful. The bulk of their forces are orcs, but they have other creatures as well, including the forest trolls." That got a reaction, gasps and angry mutterings. None of the other High Elves knew what an orc was. She hadn't herself, until she had fought them in Hillsbrad, but they all knew about the trolls. Some here, including Anasterian himself, had even fought in great troll wars long ago, some 4,000 years after Kel'Thalas was founded. "You say this horde includes trolls," a lord stated loudly. "Yet why should that concern us? Let the trolls follow these strange creatures you tell of, and hopefully march away from here. Perhaps the humans will even do us a favor and kill them for us." Several other elves laughed and nodded. "You do not understand," Illyria told them angrily. "The horde is not some distant problem we can ignore and laugh about. They intend to conquer all of Lordaeron from coast to coast, and that includes us here in Kel'Thalas. Let them come," another lord, an elven mage she thought was named Darkhan, scoffed. "Our lands are well defended. None can pass the runestones and survive." "Oh no," Illyria snarled at him. "Are you so sure? Because already the trolls have entered the forests. Already they stalk through our lands, killing our people, and the orcs will not be far behind. They are less powerful than trolls, individually, but they are numerous as locusts, enough of them to cover the land, and they are here." "Here," Anasterian scoffed. "Impossible." In answer, Illyria swung her arm and released the object she had been carrying since she and Veresa had run. The troll's head flew through the air, its short dark hair waving about it, the sun catching on a tusk, and fell again, landing just before Anasterian's feet. "This one attacked Veresa and me," Illyria explained, "not an hour's run from the river's crossing. Several more followed us to there, and their bodies still lie on the far bank unless Sylvanas and her party have moved them." She noticed that none of the lords were laughing at her anymore. "They are here," she insisted again. "The trolls are within our woods, killing our people, and the orcs are the ones burning the edges of Eversong Forest." Though she admitted to herself, she did not know how they could be causing the other fires both Veresa and Sylvanas had mentioned. Outrageous! This time Anasterian's outburst was not directed at her. The Elf King kicked the troll head, causing it to roll away under another lord's chair. His eyes were sharp and his brow drawn, and when he turned back to Illyria, she could see the energy and focus that had made him such a great king for so many years. All hints of frailty were gone, brushed aside in the current crisis. They dare to invade our home, Anasterion fumed. They dare! He looked up, and his expression was like thunder. We shall teach them to trespass here. Gather our warriors, he instructed to the other lords. Summon our rangers. We will attack the trolls and drive them from our forest so sternly they shall never dare encroach again. Ilaria was pleased to see her king so determined, and certainly agreed with the sentiment. But she shook her head anyway. The trolls are only part of the danger, she reminded Anasterion and the others. The horde is numerous beyond belief, and the orcs are strong, tough, and determined. She grinned. Fortunately, I did not come alone. Turalyon was battling a pair of orcs, and just had smashed one to the ground with his hammer, though he took a heavy blow on his shield from another. A third orc leapt at him, almost knocking him from his horse, and since the creature was too close to strike with a weapon, Turalyon headbutted him instead, his heavy helm striking the orc across the brow and the bridge of his nose, leaving him stunned. Turalyon shoved the dazed orc off his horse and onto his third foe, then used that opportunity to strike both of them good hard blows. Neither of those two would get up again. He brushed the water from the front of his helmet, taking a second to peer up at the thick gray clouds that hung above them. The rain showed no sign of letting up, though he supposed that was a good thing. At least the fires were out now, and unlikely to start again. He supposed he could stand fighting in such soggy, miserable weather if it helped keep the elven homeland from burning to the ground. Off to his side he caught a brief glimpse of Khadgar, who was laying about him with sword and staff. The wizard had exhausted his magic summoning the vast storm, which stretched across the entire front of Kel'Thalas, but he was proving formidable enough, even with mundane weapons, that Turalyon knew he should not waste time worrying about his friend. Besides, he had enough foes that he should be focusing that worry on himself instead. Turalyon was just turning to deal with a pair of orcs at his left flank when one of the two stiffened, twitched, and toppled over, an arrow through its throat. Turalyon recognized the fletching and grinned. Sure enough, a lithe young woman darted toward him a moment later, her traveled cloak's hood tossed back despite the downpour, the tips of her long pointed ears piercing the golden mane that surrounded her lovely face. Somehow the rain was ignoring her, falling around her instead of on her, and Turalyon was not sure if it was elven magic or just the sheer power of her natural beauty. I can see I got here just in time, Ilaria commented as she reached him, idly turning and putting an arrow in another orc's throat. What do you do when I am not around to save you? I manage, Turalyon replied, too caught up in battle to feel flustered by her presence. He blocked an attack and struck down the orc in question, already turning to find the next foe. Did you find them? I did, she confirmed, and they have agreed. Already the warriors and rangers are mobilized. They can be here in 10 minutes, if here is where you want them. Turalyon nodded, using his hammer's long shaft to block an axe swing, and then shortening his grip so the hammer's head struck the offending orc on the return swing. Here is as good a place as any, he answered, and as long as we are here to fight them, the horde isn't going anywhere. Ilaria nodded. I will run back and inform them. You have only to hold fast until they arrive. Her voice sounded strange, and Turalyon risked a quick glance. By the light, was she crying? She certainly looked sad. No doubt the invasion of her homeland had taken a hard toll upon her. We will hold, he assured her grimly. We must. And Ilaria was gone again. Turalyon only hoped she and her kin returned before the rest of the horde overwhelmed their tiny defense. Already waves of orcs were pouring in from the sides, and Turalyon knew his forces could not stand against the entire orc army, especially not here on an open field, where the orcs could surround them and swarm them under. They would need support, and quickly. He just hoped the elves were as ready and as capable as Ilaria made them sound. Terlidge, one of Zul'jin's subordinates, grinned. He and his pack had smelled something unpleasant nearby, and had followed their noses to a delicious sound. A single, soft thump-thump on the forest floor beneath. A lone elf. Terlidge had been charged with watching this path, which led toward the elven city, and keeping any elves from crossing it. Well, this was one elf who would go no farther. Lowering himself silently through the foliage, Terlidge caught sight of his prey. The elf was moving quickly enough for one of its kind, and most likely other creatures would have thought it quiet, but to Terlidge its passage was as loud as the thunder he heard rumbling near the forest's edge, and its pace was easily surpassed. The elf wore a long brown cloak, the hood raised, and was leaning upon a long staff. An elder, then, even better. Licking his lips with anticipation, Terlidge motioned his pack to follow him down. Then he dropped from the trees, his curved blade in one hand, and grinned at his victim and started in surprise as the elf tossed back his cloak and straightened with a grin of his own. The staff swung up and around, revealing a long blade at one end, and armor gleamed even in the shadows of the trees. "Did you think we cannot hear you rustling about above us?" the elf sneered, his narrow features pulled taut in a glower. "Did you think we cannot sense you befouling our forest? You are not welcome here, creature, and you will not be suffered to live." Terlidge recovered from his surprise and laughed. "Very clever, little pale one," he agreed. "A fine trick you be playing on Terlidge. But there is only one of you, with your little stick, and many of us." The rest of his pack landed behind him and ranged out, ready to surround the arrogant elf. But the elf only grinned more wildly, his expression nasty. "Do you think so, oaf?" he taunted. "You pride yourself on your woodcraft, yet you are blind in the forest compared to us, and deaf." Suddenly a second elf emerged from behind a nearby tree, and then a third, and a fourth. Terlidge frowned. There were more and more of them, until he and his pack were surrounded and thoroughly outnumbered, and all of them carried the same long spears and bore tall, oblong shields. This was not what he had expected. Nonetheless, Terlidge was a seasoned hunter and a warrior, and was not so easily frightened. "Better," he announced finally, rising to his full height. "A real fight, not just picking off an unarmed elf. I like it." And he leapt upon the lead elf, his sword raised high, and died in midair, the elf commander's spear sliding through his chest and piercing his heart before emerging out his back. The elf stepped to one side, letting Terlidge's body slide from his weapon, and pivoting, sweeping the spear around in a deadly arc to slice off the hand of a troll advancing upon him. The battle was over quickly. The elf leader kicked at one of the bodies, which did not move, and nodded. He had faced forest trolls before, though never here in Kel'Thalas, and while they were talented forest hunters compared to most races, they were clumsy when matched against an elf. Sylvanas had sent his patrol out, one of many, with orders to flush out and kill any trolls they could find. This was the second pack he had encountered, and he wondered how many more still crashed through the forest. He was opening his mouth to rally his men, when a slender figure burst into the clearing, golden hair streaming behind her. His ears had picked up her approach seconds before she had arrived, and clearly she had placed speed over customary stealth. "Halduran," she called as she approached, slowing to a stop a few feet before him. "Good. I have spoken with the Alliance commander, and with Sylvanas as well. She needs all of our forces along the southwest edge of the forest. That is where the Horde has gathered, and he cannot hold them for long." Halduran Brightwing nodded. "I shall inform Lothamar, for his band is near here as well," he assured her. "And we will come to the aid of your friends. Their fight is now ours, and we will not allow them to fall before these foul creatures." He paused, studying her for a second. "Are you well, Ilaria? You seem flushed." Ilaria shook her head, though a faint frown flitted across her face. "I am fine," she assured him. "Now go, bring our warriors. I will return to my sister and to the Alliance and reassure them that aid is on the way." And she was gone again, turning on her heel and dashing back into the trees. Halduran watched her go, then shook himself. He had known Ilaria Windrunner a long time, and could see that something had bothered or unsettled her. But they were all bothered on this day, when strange creatures roamed their sacred woods. Not for long, however. Gesturing to his rangers, Halduran pulled his spear free of the troll and wiped it clean on the body, then turned. There would be time to rid the forest of their filth later. First, they must deal with the foes still living. Turalyon felt it had only been minutes since Ilaria's departure when she had appeared again, surfacing through the battle to stand beside him. Her bow was slung across her back now, and she had her sword in hand instead, using it to cut down an orc that had been trying to stab his horse in the hindquarters. "They will be here," she assured him, her eyes bright, and Turalyon nodded. He felt a surge of relief, though whether at the thought of reinforcements, or the fact that she was still safe, he was not sure. He frowned, unused to such thoughts, and pushed them aside for now. First he needed to worry about him and his troops' survival. The rain had finally stopped, though the clouds remained, casting the battlefield into shadow. So when Turalyon saw a dark shape loom up off to one side, At first he thought it was simply a distorted shadow from some orc warrior, but the shape continued to grow and to gain solidity, and he stared, almost getting skewered by an orc as a result. "Stay focused," Khadgar warned, riding up beside him and kicking the orc away before it could strike again. "What are you staring at?" "That," Turalion replied, pointing with his hammer before returning his attention to the fight raging around him. Now it was Khadgar's turn to stare, and the young old wizard let out a string of curses as he saw the massive figure that had emerged from the trees and joined the far edge of the battle. It was easily twice the size of even an orc, with skin the color of aged leather. It held a massive hammer, most likely an orc two-handed weapon, but used in a single hand by the behemoth, and wore strange armor. Turalion's jaw tightened as he risked a second glance, and realized the armor was human. Breastplates and greaves and bracers linked together by thick chains to cover most of the massive creature's flesh. Its twin heads were bare, however, and glared down at the men and orcs milling before it. The hammer swept down as well, crushing 2 men in a single blow, and then swept to one side, knocking 4 more soldiers from their feet and tossing them several yards away. "What the hell is that thing?" Turalion demanded, smashing a charging orc in the face and driving it back against another, who staggered under the shared impact. "An ogre," Khadgar replied, "a 2-headed one." Turalion started to tell his friend that yes, he had seen ogres before, and he had realized this one had 2 heads, when the strange ogre raised its empty hand toward a cluster of alliance soldiers. Turalion blinked, thinking his eyes were playing tricks upon him. Had he just seen fire pour from the creature's outstretched hand toward the soldiers? He looked again. Yes, there were flames licking about the soldiers now, and the men were dropping their weapons to beat at themselves where the fires danced across their armor and clothes. Several were pulling off their cloaks, which had ignited, and others were rolling around in the grass, trying to put out the flames that tormented them. How had the strange new ogre done that? Damn, Khadgar had clearly seen it as well, if his increased cursing was any indication. He is an ogre mage. A what? A wizard, Khadgar snapped. A bloody ogre wizard. Ah, Turalion dispatched another foe and stared at the monstrous ogre again, trying to understand this. The largest, strongest creature he had ever seen, and it cast magic. Wonderful. What would it take to kill such a beast? He started to ask Khadgar this, and choked on his words as the ogre mage suddenly reeled and fell forward. The hair on the back of its head spiked straight up by the last of the rainfall. At first, Turalion thought it was leaning down to do something to the bodies before it, perhaps devour them with its twin mouths, but the creature did not get up again, and then he realized that what he had taken for hairs was too solid for that. Those were shafts, too big to be arrows. Spears. Yes. Ilaria cheered, raising her bow high in salute. My people have arrived. And she was right, Turalion saw. From the forest emerged row upon row of elves. These wore more armor than Ilaria and her rangers, and heavier gear, and carried shields and spears as well. Clearly, it had been their weapons that had felled the ogre mage. Turalion had never been so happy to see anyone in his life. They have excellent timing, he told Ilaria, having to shout to make himself heard over the chaos of combat. Can you relay messages at all? She nodded. We use gestures for hunting, and they can be read at a distance. Good, Turalion nodded, and pounded another orc into the ground as he marshaled his thoughts. We need to crush the horde between us. Tell them to advance toward us, but also to spread out along the edges and sweep in. We'll do the same. I don't want the orcs to just squeeze out the sides, because then they could close in on us instead. Ilaria nodded and began gesturing toward the forest, and Turalion saw one of the elves in front nod and turn to his fellows. Khadgar had been close enough to hear the discussion, and he was already turning toward a nearby unit leader, shouting orders and telling the man to pass them along as well. Both armies began to fan out, the Alliance forces retreating slightly so they would have room to move. The horde clearly took this as a sign of defeat, because a cheer went up among the orcs. Most of them had not seen the elves, who were still partially hidden beneath the trees. That was fine. Turalion wanted them taken by surprise as much as possible, to reduce the chance of their getting away. He pulled his men back, detailing several units to hold the orcs at bay, while others got some distance between them, and then sent a third of his troops to each side and told them to sweep back in from there. The rest he kept with him, and he could see the horde's puzzlement as he turned and led the charge straight back into their midst. On the far side, the elves had arrayed themselves in a similar fashion, and as the horde braced itself to meet Turalion's attack, the elves stepped forward, sweeping down with their spears to slice into the rearmost row of orcs. Many fell without a sound, but enough gasped or sighed or groaned that others turned to see what had disturbed their comrades. And then a ragged shout went up as the orcs realized they were beset on both sides. Several orc warriors turned and tried to run, realizing they were now trapped between two armies, but the arms of both human and elf forces curled around, blocking any escape. The orcs were forced to stand and fight, and most did so happily, losing themselves in rage and bloodlust. But with enemies on all sides, and elven bows and spears to complement human swords and axes and hammers, the orcs began to take heavy casualties. Turalyon felt a surge of hope. They were winning. The horde still outnumbered his own soldiers and the elven warriors, but they were trapped and undisciplined. Each orc was fighting for himself or the handful of others, most likely members of the same clan, and that left them vulnerable to human and elven tactics, particularly as his own men and the elves began working together more smoothly, the elven archers firing into clusters of orcs to thin their ranks and cause confusion before the humans waded in, with the elven spearmen right behind them to stab and block and to keep the orcs from ganging up on any soldiers. Already he could see visible gaps in the horde, and as the alliance and the elves moved in, those gaps expanded, leaving only pockets of the orcs behind. Then he heard a loud roar. Glancing to the east, Turalyon saw a sight that made his stomach clench. Another of those monstrous, two-headed ogres was striding into the battle, laying about with a massive club that he realized was simply a tree trunk with branches short clean. A second of the brutes was right behind the first, a similar club in its own gargantuan hand, and then a third and a fourth followed them. Where were all these creatures coming from? The two-headed ogres waded into the Alliance troops, sweeping away whole units at a time. Turalyon quickly ordered his men to fall back and let the elves handle this new menace. But the first ogre had been taken by surprise. These were better prepared. They used their clubs to knock aside the flights of arrows and volleys of spears, and then crashed into the elves, sending the slender warriors flying. The horde began to reform around these massive figures, and more orcs poured in behind them, filling their ranks back out and quickly shifting the numbers back in their favor. "We have to do something fast," Turalyon shouted to Khadgar, who was beside him again. "Otherwise, they'll sweep us back toward the mountains, or west toward the water, and we'll be the ones trapped." Khadgar started to reply, but Ilaria interrupted him. "Listen," she shouted. Her ears quivered. Turalyon shook his head. "I can't hear anything except fighting," he told her. "What is it?" She grinned up at him. "Help," she answered. "Help from above." "There, I see them." "Aye, I see them as well, laddie," Curdran Wildhammer snapped, privately annoyed that the young griffin rider beside him had spotted the battle first. "Circle around, lads, and then aim for those monstrous brutes in the center. Mind the clubs, though." Tapping Skyrie with his heels, the Wildhammer leader sent her screaming around and down toward the battlefield. One of the strange two-headed monsters glanced up and, seeing them, roared in reply, but Curdran was moving too fast to evade, especially with orc warriors everywhere, hampering the giant's progress. As he dropped, Curdran raised his stormhammer, muscles tensing in anticipation. The beast roared again and swung at him with that massive club, but Skyrie dodged the blow and flew so close her wingtip brushed one of the creature's faces. Then Curdran threw, putting all of his considerable strength into the toss. The skies echoed with thunder, and a lightning bolt struck the creature just as he did, lending its strength to the impact. The creature reeled back, its one head caved in, the other blackened and toppled. It crushed 3 orcs when it fell, and its club smashed into several more. "Yes," Curdran whooped, catching his hammer as it returned, and nudging Skyrie up for another diving charge. "That showed 'em, my beauty. It don't matter how big they are, the Wildhammers can bring 'em low." He raised his hammer high, and let out a loud whoop as he rose into the sky, his griffin easily slipping past another brute's clumsy overhand swipe. "What are you lot waiting for?" he bellowed at his warriors, who grinned from their own circling mounts. "I've shown you how it's done. Now get down there and make sure the rest of these giants come crashing down as well." They saluted mockingly, knowing his taunts were good-natured, and wheeled their griffins around to begin their own attacks. Curdran grinned. He glanced down and spotted the mage, the elf, and the commander he had met back in Airy Peak. "Ho down there," he bellowed, raising his hammer and twirling it above him. The elf raised her bow in salute, and the commander and the mage both nodded greetings. "Your Lord Lothar sent us," Kurdran shouted, not sure they could hear him from this altitude. And just in time, looks like. Then he brought his hammer back down, gripping it with both hands once again, and steered Skyri back down toward the next of the mammoth two-headed creatures. Several had fallen already, and the horde was scattering around them, realizing their protectors were now actually a danger to them, and the humans and the elves were using that chaos to slaughter their panicked orcs left and right. Then something shifted in the wind, and Kurdran glanced up. Above him to the south, he saw a dark shape gliding down. At first he thought it might be one of his own warriors, come to relay news or orders, but then realized that it did not fly right for a griffin, and it seemed to be coming from more to the east, past the hinterlands, and possibly below them. But what? Breaking off his attack, Kurdran brought Skyri back up beyond the brute's reach and circled slowly, watching the approaching shadow. Was it a bird? If so, it was higher than most, and its outline was strange. Some new form of attack. He laughed. It was no bigger than an eagle. Were the horde sending eagles after them now, perhaps with gnomes perched on their backs? As if any raptor could stand against his beauty, he thought, patting Skyri's neck affectionately and receiving a musical caw in return. But the shape was closer now, and growing larger, and larger, and larger still. "By the Airy," Kurdran muttered, awed by its size. What was this thing that could stay aloft and be so large? It was already as big as his Skyri, and he had a suspicion it was still high above him. Now he could make out its shape more clearly, long and lean, with a long tail and a neck and great wings spread high above it and flapping only occasionally. The thing was gliding. It had to be high indeed to be coasting on the winds that way, and Kurdran felt a chill as he re-estimated its size again. He only knew of one airborne creature that large, and he couldn't imagine what one of them would want with this conflict. But then the last of the clouds faded away, and the sun shone down upon them, and gleamed red all along the creature, turning it into a soaring crimson streak. And Kurdran knew he had been right. It was a dragon. "Dragon!" he shouted. Most of his warriors were still battling the two-headed brutes, but young Murkhad glanced up and looked where Kurdran was pointing. Then the fool actually kicked his griffin into a rapid ascent, the mount flaring her wings out to gain altitude. "What are ye doing, ye halfwit?" Kurdran shouted, but if Murkhad heard, he gave no reply. Instead, the youthful Wildhammer turned his mount toward the dragon, which was now angled in a steep dive, and raised his Stormhammer high. Giving a fierce yell, Murkhad charged straight for the plummeting lizard, and vanished without a sound as the dragon opened its mouth, revealing great triangular teeth the size of a large dwarf, and a long forked tongue the color of blood, and consumed the hapless dwarf and his griffin in a single snap. Murkhad never even saw the sorrow evident in the dragon's enormous golden eyes, or the burly green-skinned figure perched on the dragon's back, long leather reins wrapped around one hand. By the light! Turalion had cheered with the others when the Wildhammers had arrived, and when Kurdran felt the first two-headed ogre. But he had glanced up again at a faint cry from the Wildhammer leader, and had looked in time to see the fiery dragon descend upon one of the griffin riders and swallow him like he was a sausage. And now the dragon was descending upon them, and more were right behind it, streaks of crimson dropping from the sky. The red dragons were not just the color of flame. Smoke curled from their nostrils, and sparks shot from their mouths as they breathed, brighter even than the sunlight gleaming off their claws and along their wings and tails. The smoke and sparks increased as Turalion stared, and he suddenly realized what was about to happen. "Pull back," he shouted, slapping Khadgar's arm with a shield to get the mage's attention. "Have everyone pull back." He waved his hammer overhead, hoping that would get both his own people and the elves' attention. "Pull back, everyone! Away from the forest, now!" "Away from the forest?" Valeria asked sharply, glancing up at him. He hadn't even realized she was still beside him, which showed how stunned he had been. "Why? We're winning!" Turalion started to explain, then realized there probably wasn't time. "Just do it," he shouted, seeing the surprise on her face. "Tell your people to fall back toward the hills. Hurry!" Something in his voice or expression convinced her, and she nodded, raising her bow and trying to signal the other elven warriors. Turalion left her to it and turned away, grabbing the first Alliance officer he found and relaying his orders again. The officer nodded and started shouting and shoving, turning his troops around while bellowing for other officers to do the same. There was nothing else Turalion could do. He wheeled his own horse around and kicked it into a gallop, racing for the hills. Then he heard a strange sound, like a sudden burst of wind or a loud exhalation from a big man, and glanced over his shoulder. The first dragon had swooped down, wings outspread, and opened its mouth wide. And from that mouth poured flames, great waves of flame that spread across the forest's front edge. The heat was intense, sapping every bit of moisture instantly, and the forest seemed to waver like a mirage in the sun's glare. Trees blackened in an instant, crumbling to ash despite being soaked minutes before, and smoke rose from them, thick black smoke that threatened to block out the sun again. The flames did not die. Either in some places they had licked the trees farther back, not enough to destroy them completely, but enough to ignite them, and now the flames were spreading, dancing from tree to tree. It was almost hypnotic, and Turalion had forced himself to turn back around and watch where his horse was going. But soon he had reached the foothills and swung his mount back around, watching the horrible devastation. "Do something!" Ilaria yelled, appearing beside him again as he sat on his horse and squinted against the light and the heat. She pounded on his leg with her fists. "Do something!" "There's nothing I can do," Turalion pointed out, his heart breaking at the grief throbbing in her voice. "I wish there was." "Then you do something," the Elven Ranger demanded, turning to Khadgar as he rode up beside them. "Use your magic. Put out the flames." But the old-seeming mage shook his head sadly. "There's too much fire for me to combat it all," he explained softly. "And I've already drained myself for the day summoning that storm earlier." He said the last part bitterly, and Turalion felt for his friend. It wasn't Khadgar's fault that he had put out the first wave of fires only to have these far worse blazes appear now. "I need to get to Silvermoon," Ilaria said, more to herself than to them. "My parents are there, and our elders. I need to help them." "And what will you do?" Turalion asked, his words coming out harsher than he intended, though at least it snapped her out of her grief long enough to look up at him. "Do you have a way to combat these flames?" He gestured at the forest, where the dragons were now diving and wheeling like bats at play, spreading flames with every pass. As far as the eye could see now, Kel'Thalas was burning. The smoke seemed a solid wall of gray above the elven homeland, and its shadow reached them on the foothills and cast darkness behind them, across the mountains. Turalion was sure they could see the conflagration in Capital City. Ilaria shook her head and saw tears streaming down her cheeks. "But I have to do something," she all but wailed, her normally lovely voice hoarse with anger and pain. "My home is dying. I know, and I understand." Reaching down, Turalion rested one hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently. "But going in there now would only spell your death. Even if you could get to the river, it must be boiling from all that heat. You'd die, and that would not help anyone." She looked up at him. "My family, the lords, will they be all right?" He could hear the desperation in her voice. She wanted, perhaps needed, to believe they survived. "They're powerful magi," Khadgar pointed out, "and while I've never seen it, I understand the Sunwell is a source of immense power. They'll shield the city from harm. Even the dragons won't be able to touch them." He sounded completely certain, though Turalion saw his friend quirk one eyebrow at him, as if to say, "At least I hope so." Ilaria nodded, though she was clearly still shaken. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You are right. My death now would accomplish nothing." Turalion suspected she was trying to convince herself of that. She glared at the dragons fluttering and soaring beyond. "But theirs would. The entire hordes would, especially the orcs." Her green eyes narrowed, and Turalion saw something there he had not seen in her before. Hatred. "They brought this destruction upon us," she spat. "Now we'll see them suffer for it." "We all will." Turalion looked up as another elf strode toward them. He was dressed in full war gear, his armor beautiful and graceful, but clearly functional and covered in blood and gore. At his side hung a long sword, and a deep green cloak fluttered behind him. He had removed his leaf-patterned helm, and dark brown eyes shone beneath glossy hair the color of corn silk, and his expression mirrored Illyria's own. "Lord Thamar Theron," Ilaria introduced him, "one of our finest rangers." Then she turned and smiled briefly as a second elf approached. This one, a tall woman with a similar cloak and features much like Illyria's own, though her hair was a shade darker. "And this is my sister, Sylvanas Windrunner, Ranger General and commander of our forces." Sylvanas, Lord Theron, this is Sir Turalion of the Silver Hand, second in command of the Alliance forces, and Khadgar of Dalaran, mage. Turalion nodded, and Theron returned the gesture, a show of respect among equals. Most of my warriors escaped the Inferno, Theron told him brusquely. We cannot breach the flames, however, and so we are trapped without, while our families are trapped within. Now we know how the fire spread through the forest so quickly and from so many directions. His hand tightened on the hilt of his sword. But we cannot linger on such thoughts, he announced, his words directed at Ilaria and perhaps himself as well. We are here, and we must do what we can to succor our people as quickly as possible, and that means destroying the forces threatening them. Your commander, Anduin Lothar, sent word to us once before, asking for our participation in this alliance, Sylvanas stated, looking up at Turalion. My leaders chose not to respond beyond a token show of support. Her gaze flickered to Ilaria, and something like a smile crossed her face. Though some of our rangers took it upon themselves to lend aid to your cause. Then she sobered again. But my elders realized their error when the trolls and orcs invaded our lands. For if Kel'Thalas is not safe from incursion, what is? They ordered me to assemble our warriors and march to meet you, and to render such aid as we could. She bowed. We would be proud to join your alliance, Sir Turalion, and I hope that our deeds henceforth will compensate for the tardiness of our involvement. Turalion nodded, wishing once again that Lothar was here. The champion would know how to handle this situation properly, but he was not, and so Turalion was forced to muddle through as best he could. I thank you, and your people, he told Sylvanas finally. We welcome you and all your kin to our alliance. Together, we will drive the Horde from this continent, from your lands and ours. Then we may afterward live in peace and cooperation once again. Anything else he had planned to say was interrupted by a squawk overhead, and the sudden fluttering of wings. Turalion ducked, as did Khadgar, and Theron reached for his sword. But the descending creature was far smaller than a dragon, and covered in feathers and fur rather than scales. Sorry, lad, Kurgan Wildhammer said as he landed Skyrie just beyond them, causing the horses to shudder and stamp their feet in dismay. We tried, but those dragons are simply too big and too powerful for the handful of us to face. Give us time, and we'll be finding a way to face them in the sky and beat them down, but right now, they've got the upper hand. Turalion nodded. Thank you for your efforts, he told the dwarf leader, and for your aid earlier. It saved many lives. He glanced around him. Khadgar, Ilaria, Sylvanas, Lord Thamar Theron, and Kurgan Wildhammer. These were good people and good lieutenants. He suddenly did not feel so alone, or so self-conscious. With them at his side, perhaps he could be a leader, at least until Lothar returned. We need to get our people out of here, he told them after a moment. We will return and free Kel'Thalas from the Horde, but right now we need to regroup and wait. I suspect the Horde is not going to stay here for long. They have some other goal in mind. But what, he wondered. They had taken the forest and driven the elves from their home. They had attacked Area Peak and crushed Cosmodon. Where would they strike next? He tried to think of it from the orcs' point of view. If he were them, and was handling their campaign, where would he go? What was the single biggest remaining threat? Then it hit him. The biggest threat was the heart of the Alliance itself, the place where it all started. He glanced at Khadgar, who nodded, clearly thinking the same thing. Capital City. It made sense. From Silvermoon, which stood at the northern tip of Kel'Thalas, the orcs could march over the mountains and directly into Lordaeron, emerging not far from Lordamere Lake and Capital City itself. The city had few defenders left, King Taranis having sent most of his men with the Alliance. Fortunately, marching over the mountains would mean making their way across Alterac first, and while Perinold had not been the most stalwart member of the Alliance, he would certainly rally his forces against an invasion of his own lands. But the orcs could overwhelm Alterac through sheer numbers, and then swarm down out of the mountains to strike the city. From Lordaeron, they could spread down across the rest of the continent, Ilaria pointed out. And if they left a force here, they would have 2 points of origin. They could blanket the land with orcs in weeks. Turalion nodded. Now we know what they are planning, he said. Sure, they were right. Which means we need to find a way to stop them. He glanced at the raging fires beyond. But not here. Get the men back to the hills proper, and we will meet to discuss this further. Then he wheeled his horse around and cantered away from the forest, trusting his lieutenants to see his orders carried out, and unwilling to look any more at the majestic woods burning behind him. Chapter 15. "Let's go," Doomhammer shouted. "Get your gear and get moving." He watched the warriors for a moment, as their chieftain shouted and shoved and punched to get them ready, then turned back to Gul'dan, who stood waiting patiently nearby. "What?" he demanded. "My clan and I will remain here for a time," Gul'dan replied. "I have other plans for the Altars of Storms, plans that will aid the Horde in its conquest." Doomhammer frowned. He still did not trust the short, ugly warlock, but he had to admit that the two-headed ogres had proven themselves immensely useful in the battle to take Hel'Thalas. True, those cursed dwarves and their griffins had interfered and cost him several of the creatures, but without the ogres they might not have broken the Alliance lines and been able to regroup. Finally he nodded. "Do what you must," he told Gul'dan, "but do not take too long. We will need every advantage if we want to conquer Lordaeron quickly." "I will not delay," Gul'dan assured him, grinning. "You are right. Speed is of the essence." The way he said it troubled Doomhammer. But just then Zuluhead came running up, and the chief warlock slipped away from Doomhammer's penetrating gaze, while he was listening to the latest report about the forest's remaining defenders. "We cannot breach their defenses," the Dragonmaw chieftain was saying. He looked more angry than apologetic. "Even the dragons can do nothing," he insisted, shaking his head. "Their fire washes over the city, but does not touch it, and their claws are repelled by an invisible barrier they cannot break." "It is the Sunwell," Gul'dan commented, turning back to take part in the conversation. "The elven source of magic. It gives them immense power." Of course the warlock would know about such a thing, Doomhammer reasoned. "Is there any way to destroy it, or drain it, or tap it for ourselves?" he asked. But Gul'dan shook his head. "I have tried," he admitted. "I can feel its power."
What can I do for you? Safe travels. Hello. Have a good one.
but it is of a kind unfamiliar to me, and I cannot touch it." He scratched at his bristly beard. "I suspect only the elves can gain its power, for it is tied to them in this land." "Can you use the altars of storms to break their defenses?" was Doomhammer's next question. Gul'dan grinned again. "That is one of the things I am attempting," he replied. "I do not yet know if it will work, but the altars are crafted from the elves' own runestones, which were originally powered by the Sunwell. I may be able to use that link in reverse, sending my own magic into their power source, and either destroying it or wresting it away from them." It was clear which one the warlock would prefer, and Doomhammer disliked the idea of placing such potency in his hands. But that would still be better than leaving it to these strange, silent, deadly elves. "Do what you can," he told Gul'dan again, "but breaching the city is secondary. We cannot get in right now, but they cannot get out either." He turned back to Zuluhead, who stood waiting. "The same goes for your dragons. We may need them, particularly if the Alliance has more warriors waiting at Capital City. If you have not managed to break their barrier after a few more days, leave it, and send your dragons to join the rest of the Horde." He glanced at Gul'dan, who had already walked beyond the hearing range. "And make sure he and his warlocks accompany you." Zuluhead grinned. "I will drag him with us if I have to order a dragon to snap him up and carry him in its belly," he promised. Doomhammer nodded, then left the Dragonmaw chieftain to speak with his dragon riders, and went to make sure his own Blackrock warriors were ready to set out toward their next target. It was another 2 hours before the Horde finally moved out. Gul'dan and Cho'Gall watched as waves of orc warriors marched from Kel'Thalas, tramping over the charred remains of the trees that had fallen to the dragon's flames. Fully a third of the forest had burned, and that stretch was littered with soot and ash and the stray leaf that had crisped but not yet crumbled. The warriors had camped there, feeling more comfortable in the open air than under the remaining trees, even if the ground was littered with bits of bark and leaf and nut. And now, clouds of soot rose from many of the feet stomping back across and toward the foothills and the mountains beyond. Doomhammer strode at their head, his long legs eating up the distance, his weapon bouncing slightly against his back and legs as he walked. He did not look around, clearly confident that he was in no danger whatsoever. Gul'dan waited until the last marching orc had vanished from view. Then he turned to Cho'Gall. "Are we ready?" Both of the Twilight's Hammer chieftains' heads grinned. "Ready," he replied. Gul'dan nodded. "Good. Tell your warriors we march at once. It is a long way back to South Shore." He rubbed at his beard. "Zuluhead is occupied with that elven city, and will not even notice we have gone until it is too late." "What if he sends his dragons after us?" Cho'Gall asked, his normal disregard for danger faltering at the thought of those massive creatures hurtling down upon them. "He will not," Gul'dan assured the ogre. "He would not dare do so without Doomhammer's orders, and that means first sending a messenger after the rest of the Horde, and then waiting for a reply. We will be well beyond his reach by then, and Doomhammer will not be able to spare any of his remaining troops to come after us, not if he wants to take that human city." He laughed. For weeks he had been trying to think of a way to break free of Doomhammer and pursue his own agenda, and the war chief had actually handed him the perfect solution. He had half expected Doomhammer to insist he accompany the rest of the Horde on the march, but the elves' resistance had provided him with the perfect excuse to remain behind. "I will see to the warriors," Cho'Gall promised, and turned away, already bellowing orders. Gul'dan nodded and moved off to gather his own gear. He was looking forward to this march. Each step would take him farther from Doomhammer and his careful scrutiny, and bring him closer to his destiny. Doomhammer crept down the narrow trail that cut into the mountain peak, heading toward the small valley below. It was night, and the rest of the Horde was sleeping, but he had urgent business to attend. He moved silently, his boots finding solid purchase on the well-worn rock, one hand holding his hammer so that it did not bounce across his back and glance against the rock walls, the other in front of him to help him feel his way down the path. The moon was half full overhead, providing him with ample light, and he could hear the chirping of some insect nearby. Otherwise, the mountains were silent. He had nearly reached the valley when he heard different noises, the sound of someone, or something, roughly orc-sized, moving clumsily toward the valley from the far side. Doomhammer crouched down, using the sides of the trail for cover, and tugged his hammer away from his shoulder, holding it before him. He peered out cautiously, waiting as the sounds grew louder. Then he saw movement off to one side, and watched as a cloaked figure pulled itself up the last incline and stepped into the valley. It was not much of a valley, more of a nook, perhaps 20 feet wide and 15 feet deep, but the rocks rose on every side, providing it with both some shelter and decent concealment. Presumably, that was the reason it had been selected. As Doomhammer watched unmoving, the figure leaned against one of the rocks, gasping for breath, then straightened and looked around. "Hello," the cloaked man called softly. "I am here," Doomhammer replied, straightening and stepping between the rocks to leave the trail and enter the valley himself. The stranger straightened and gave a small gasp as he approached. Doomhammer could see a longsword at the man's side, well made and unblemished, and knew the stranger had never used it. Why did he repeatedly find himself dealing with cowards and weaklings and schemers? He wondered. Why not warriors, who were far more direct in their desires and blunt about their intended methods? He had seen the man leading the Alliance armies at Kel'Thalas, and a different man leading them in Hillsbrad, and had been impressed by both. They would be fighters, following a code of honor and respecting strength and honesty, but of course such men never would have requested a meeting such as this one. "You are Lord Doomhammer," the man stammered, shrinking back from him slightly. "You speak common." "I am Ogrim Doomhammer, chieftain of the Blackrock clan and war chief of the Horde, and I know your tongue," Doomhammer confirmed. "And you, human, you sent me that message." "I am," the man replied, tugging at his hood as if to make sure it still concealed his face. It was of fine cloth, Doomhammer saw, and richly embroidered along the hems. "I thought it might be best if we met before any unpleasantness occurred," he spoke slowly, as if to a child. "Very well." Doomhammer glanced around, making sure the human had not brought assassins, but if so, he was unable to scent or hear them. He had to take the risk that this human really had come alone, and his strange message had claimed. "I had not expected a human to contact me," Doomhammer admitted quietly, crouching so he could study the man more easily, "especially in such a manner. Is that how you humans communicate? By use of trained birds?" "It is one method, yes," the man replied. "I knew none of my people would be able to get close enough to convey a message to you, and was not sure how else to reach you, so I sent the bird. Did you kill it?" Doomhammer nodded, unable to hold back the grin that crossed his face. The man started and broke into a sweat at the sight. "We did not realize it was a messenger until we found the parchment tied to its leg. By then, it was too late. I hope you did not want it back." His companion waved the apology aside with one slender gloved hand. His hand shook, but his voice was almost steady. "It was only a bird," he pointed out. "I am more interested in preventing a much larger number of regrettable deaths." Doomhammer nodded. "So your message said. What do you want from me?" "Assurances," the man replied. "Of what sort?" "I want your word, as a warrior and a leader, that you will keep your warriors in check," the man answered. "No killing, raiding, razing, or other atrocities here in the mountains. Leave our cities and villages intact, and do not hound or hunt our people." Doomhammer considered this, idly rubbing his hammer's head with one hand. "And what do we gain in return?" Now the man smiled. A cold expression meant no doubt to be friendly, but seeming only conniving. "Free passage," he answered slowly, letting two words hang in the still night air. "Oh," Doomhammer tilted his head, indicating that the man should continue. "You and your warriors seek to cross the mountains and invade Lordaeron," the man pointed out. "These peaks are treacherous, and it is easy for those who know them to combat much larger forces. Your horde might still win through, but only with heavy losses. And then you would be weakened in your battle against Lordaeron and its defenders." He smiled again and leaned back against the rock, clearly pleased with his reading of the situation and his ability to alter it. "I can make sure this region's defenders stay clear of your army," he said confidently. "I will even show you which paths to take to cross the distance more rapidly. Your horde can pass through the mountains quickly and unopposed." Doomhammer considered this. "You will clear the way for us," he said out loud, "in exchange for us leaving your lands unharmed and returned." The man nodded. "That is correct." Doomhammer stood and stepped forward, until he was less than 2 feet from the man. This close, he could make out some of the stranger's features beneath the hood, and they were narrow and elegant and calculating despite his obvious fear. The man reminded him of Gul'dan in some ways, clever and out for his own gain, but most likely too cowardly to betray a stronger force. "Very well," he said finally. "I agree. Show me the quickest path through these mountains, and I will lead my warriors through at speed, without stopping for plunder. When we conquer this land, I will place my protection around these mountains, that none may violate them. You and yours shall be safe." "Excellent." The cloaked man smiled and clapped his hands together like a child. "I knew you would be reasonable." He pulled a rolled-up parchment from his belt and handed it to Doomhammer. "Here is a map of this area," he explained. "I have marked this valley to help orient you." Doomhammer unrolled the map and studied it. "Yes, this is very clear," he said after a moment. "Good." The man watched him a second. "I will return to my own people, then," he said after a pause. Doomhammer nodded, but did not say anything, and after a moment the man turned and walked away quickly, ducking back between the rocks and carefully working his way down the cliff beyond the valley. For a moment, Doomhammer considered going after him. A single quick blow would finish such a man, and he already had the map. But that would be dishonorable. One of the things he hated about his own people, about what they had become, was their lack of honor. Before, on Draenor, they had been a noble race, but Gul'dan's treachery had changed all of that, making them little more than bloodthirsty savages. Doomhammer was determined to restore his race's pride and purity, and that meant following a strict code of behavior. The man had treated him in good faith, and Doomhammer would not betray that. He would follow the path the man had marked, and if it proved quick and the human troops did not block them, he would honor his half of the agreement. With a shake of his head, Doomhammer re-rolled the scroll and stuck it in his own belt, then returned back toward the trail he had used to reach this valley. He would summon his lieutenants once he returned and show them the route they would take. "You summoned us, Your Majesty." General Hath, the commander of Alterax's forces, stood at the half-open door to the map room. Paranold could see the other army commanders behind the stout general. "Yes, come in, General, officers," Paranold said, trying to keep his voice calm, beckoning them in. "I have just received some new information about the Horde and its movements, and wish to share it with you." He saw Hath and a few of the others exchange quick glances, but they said nothing as they followed him over to the impressive tapestry map covering the far wall. It showed Alterac from edge to edge, with towns and forts picked out in silver thread, and the castle itself in gold. "I have it under good authority," Paranold began, "that the Horde is indeed heading toward us." Several of the officers gasped. They apparently plan to invade Lordaeron, and have chosen to cross the mountains and approach Capital City from the north side. "How far away are they?" Colonel Cavden asked urgently. "How many of them are there? What sort of weapons are they carrying?" Several of the others were murmuring behind him. Paranold held up a hand, and the officers fell silent. "I do not know how far away they are," he answered, "though I suspect a day, perhaps 2, no more. I have no idea of their numbers, but certainly from all the reports, they are a formidable force." He smiled, though he knew it was weak. "That, however, is no longer our concern." General Hath straightened. "Not our concern, Your Majesty?" he asked, his breath setting his thick graying mustache aflutter. "But we are a part of the Alliance, and have pledged ourselves to battling the Horde together." "The situation has changed," Paranold informed him, aware that he was sweating heavily, and that his officers had noticed. "I have reconsidered our options, and have decided to realign ourselves in the conflict. Alterac is no longer a part of the Alliance, effective immediately." He took a deep breath. "Believe me, we are far better off this way." The officers all looked surprised. "How do you mean, Your Majesty?" Cavden asked. "I have formed a non-aggression treaty with the Horde," Paranold replied. "We will not hinder their progress through the mountains, and in return, they will leave Alterac unharmed and untouched." His officers looked troubled, a few of them even angry or ill. "You will have us conspire with the Orcs, Your Majesty?" Hath asked softly, disgust evident in his tone. "Yes, I would have us conspire with them," Paranold snapped, losing his composure, "because I would have us survive." He let his anger and his terror boil over into his words. "Do you have any idea what we are facing? The Horde, The entire horde is planning to sweep through these mountains, through our homes. Do you have any idea how many of them there are? Thousands, tens of thousands. Hath nodded grudgingly, as did a few of the others. They had seen the same reports he had. And do you have any idea what these orcs are like? I have seen one of them, no farther away from me than you are now. They are enormous, nearly as tall as trolls, and twice as wide, massively muscled, with tusks and fangs. This one carried a hammer it would take 3 men to lift, and he waved it about as if it were a child's toy. No man can stand against that. They'll kill us all, don't you understand? They have already destroyed Stormwind, and Alterac will be next. But the Alliance hath began. Paranold laughed bitterly. The Alliance what? He demanded. Where are they now? Not here, I'll tell you that. We formed the Alliance to protect our kingdoms against exactly this sort of attack. But here we are, with the Horde breathing down our necks, and the precious Alliance is nowhere in sight. They've abandoned us, don't you see? He could hear his voice rising to near hysteria, and sought to rein it back in. It is every kingdom for itself now, he told them as calmly as he could manage. I have to think about Alterac first. The other kings would do the same. Yes, but these brutes, another officer, Trand, started, are monstrous and deadly, yes? Paranold cut him off.